Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 6. We are diving into memory now. So a little bit of a warning before we get into this. Number one is that we got 3 chapters of memory. So we have lots and lots of memory to cover. That's just kind of how most cognitive psychology textbooks are. This one has 3 chapters. The last one that I used to use had 2 chapters. But at any rate, this just speaks to how much or how big a field memory is in the research for cognitive psychology. So it is a kind of a big, big area. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I actually teach a senior capstone on this subject. So it's just memory. So that's the senior capstone. And so you easily can develop or expand these 3 chapters into a full semester. There's a lot of content. I'm not going to try to go nearly into that much depth, obviously, but just a little bit of a warning that there's a lot of stuff here, and it can be easy to feel a little bit overwhelmed. And if you do, that's okay. Just let me know, and I'll tell you the important things to focus on. But if you like it, then you should take that class. But also, there's lots and lots of avenues of new things to learn about memory that we're discovering all the time. All right, so anyways, let's get into it. So Chapter 6 is about memory. So we are going to talk about a couple of things in this video series for this chapter. Mostly what we're going to be doing, we're gonna deviate a little bit from the textbook. The way that we are going to divide these 3 chapters, this chapter, we're mostly going to be talking about the structure of memory. So we're going to be talking about the leading models of what memory is and how it's conceptualized. Chapter 7, we're mostly going to be talking about the processes of memory, so how memory works. And then in Chapter 8, we're going to be talking about some of the unusual cases of memory. Specifically, we're going to be talking about things like how emotion and how things like false memories can affect our overall memory. All right, so for this chapter, like I mentioned, we're mostly going to be talking about the structure of memory. So we're going to be talking about the early history of this stuff, but we're also going to be talking about what is now called the modal of memory. So let's just get straight into it. Now, whenever I'm in a classroom, usually I like to ask, kind of for every chapter, but specifically for this one, what is memory? Because this is, again, like attention, it is something that we all know what it is, but we have a hard time putting it into words. And so usually you'll find it defined as something like the ability to recall events or information not currently present in the environment. Which is fine. That's a cool, big, broad, kind of definition. But I think that it doesn't do a good job of capturing just how much of our lives revolve around memory and how important memory is. So memory, both in this class and just in this field broadly, is really, the definition changes depending on what specifically we are looking at. So, for example, you'll see these are just different kinds of memory, and by the end of these 3 chapters, you'll be familiar with all of these. But we have episodic memory, we have semantic memory, we have long-term memory, iconic memory, working memory, implicit memory, explicit memory, declarative memory, non-declarative memory, priming, classical conditioning. We have all these different things that can be considered memory depending on how we are testing this stuff. So, for example, just as an example, this first piece right here, episodic memory, is about how we remember things that have happened to us. So, for example, if I ask you, what did you have for breakfast? The way that you would be able to remember what that is through the episodic memory. Your ability to remember how to write in cursive, or your ability to ride a bike or to play an instrument, that's going to be a very different form of memory. That is going to be an implicit memory. So those are 2 very broad or very different kinds of memories. But you get the idea that just sticking to this definition doesn't quite give us the kind of level of detail or analysis that we're really looking for. So the next couple of chapters, what we're going to be looking at is Chapter 6. We're looking at different structures of memory. Chapter 7, we're going to be talking a lot about the different processes of memory. And Chapter 8 is dedicated to remembering complex events. Okay, so again, if I was in a classroom, this would be much easier to do. Because usually I like to give lots and lots of examples about how memory works, because it's much easier to kind of prove points that way. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just turn your head away from the computer, or just close your eyes, because normally this is the part where I would probably turn off the projector and read out a list of words and then ask you to recall those words. So if you close your eyes, this might be kind of fun. If you don't close your eyes, it's gonna be wicked boring. All right, so here we go. I'm gonna pretend that you closed your eyes. All right, so here we go. I'm gonna read out a list of words: coast, destruction, spot, afraid, clever, cowardly, oceanic, zephyr, flowers, branch, pipe, floor, juicy, crib, carpenter. Okay, so you can open up your eyes now. So I listed out a number of words, right? And so what I would do if we were in the classroom is I would ask you to report how many of those you can remember. So take out a paper and write down as many of those as you can remember, or bring up a Word doc and type in as many as you can remember. And usually whenever that happens, people will remember. They're not going to remember all of them. They're not even really going to usually remember half of them. Some people do, but most people don't. Most people will remember maybe 5, maybe 6, maybe 7 words, which is really cool, because that takes us back to chapter 1 when we were talking about the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, and how we have kind of this limit to human memory. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of these things. All right. I'm going to give you one more example. So again, just close your eyes. I'll read off a list of about 15 words. Here we go. Report, compete, please, inexpensive, black and white, acrid, squeak, offend, symptomatic, contain, glamorous, camp, rail, board, snow. Okay, so again, try to remember how many of those you can. I just read them off, and for the most part, we're not going to remember all of them. I certainly wouldn't remember all of them. But as we go through some of these next slides, I want you to think about how many you remembered, and specifically which ones you remembered. We might find a pattern by the end of this chapter, and that will help us explain how that works in chapter 7. Okay, so this guy right here, he is, this is Herman Ebbinghaus. He is not a man that was attacked by a pine cone, which is what his beard looks like. He is usually considered the first modern memory researcher, so he's not a philosopher, he was a scientist. He was back in the early days of Germany, or German psychological research, doing memory research. Now, a lot of his stuff, to be honest with you, is not going to pass muster for today's standards. It just doesn't hold up by how we hold ourselves to research methods. So as I talk about the way he experimented, keep an open mind. I know that it's flawed. You'll know that it's flawed. But I want you to think about whether or not the lessons that he learned would still hold up today. Okay, so here we go. So the big thing is that he did his work alone, which means that he was basically his only participant. He did a lot of work where he was the only participant. Just imagine if you've taken research methods too. Imagine trying to pull that over on Dr. Camilleri or Dr. Bressler or Dr. Hayes, where you're going to tell them, yep, I just got one subject and it's me. That's not going to happen, right? But he did it, and again, I want you to keep an open mind and think about whether or not his methods would matter if you were testing yourself or not. So what he did in his experiments, pretty much all of them, is he would take a list of nonsense syllables. So he would basically create these syllables that didn't mean anything. So he would do that by using a consistent pattern where you'd have a consonant, a vowel, and then a consonant. And he would create these lists of words or lists of syllables that just don't mean anything. They're just gibberish. And he would try his best to remember those lists of words. And he would see how many times he needed to be exposed to those lists in order to remember that list perfectly. And not only that, he would also test himself at different delays, so that he would test himself after 24 hours or after 48 hours or after 72 hours or after 10 weeks and so on. So here are a couple of examples of those. Obviously, these words or these consonants don't mean anything. That is important because he wanted to make sure that what we are remembering is not in any way biased to previous experience. So, for example, if you had cat, which follows this rule, right? Consonant, vowel, consonant. You could imagine a cat. You might even have a special connection with a cat, and that might help you remember that easier. That word easier. So he decided, let's not do that, and so that's why he used nonsense syllables here. I think that's important. All right. So what he would do, he would memorize this list of words. He'd give himself some delay, some time, and then he would test himself again, and he would do it over and over and over again until he got 100%. If he didn't get 100%, he'd start back at the first bullet point and do it again until he got it. And so the questions that he was interested in is how much do we remember, and whether or not that changes over time. And that led to a super big, super important finding called the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve is this function, this trend of the data that Ebbinghaus found over and over and over again. And essentially, what he found is that if you test yourself immediately after you've remembered a list of words, you're going to have forgotten a lot of it. But as you move on, as the days go by, you forget less and less and less of what you remembered. That's kind of a weird way to think about it. So that's why I'm glad that I have this figure down here to illustrate that. And so here what we can see on the y-axis, and again, this is oversimplified data. This is not real data. This is just made to convey the point. What we have on the y-axis is going to be essentially what percentage of that information do you remember, and on the x-axis we're going to have how many days have gone by. And so you can think about this as how much of the chapter do you remember after studying it. And so right after we study it, you can already see it starting to fall down, right? It's already starting to go down. But as days went on, we start to forget less and less. In other words, we tend to retain those memories. So, and again, I know that sounds kind of weird, but let me show you what I mean. That essentially, if we were to, let's say, look at the first day, within the first 24 hours, we've already forgotten about 50% of that chapter, which is a bunch, right? That is a scary feeling going into an exam. But if we were to look at the difference between days 5 and day 6, we're only forgetting 7% at that point. It's not linear. In other words, it's not the case that each day we forget 50%. It's that rate slows down as time goes on. And again, this data is idealized. It's just meant as a way to kind of help convey this idea. One way that I like to think about it, because this can be very pessimistic, right? Basically what we're saying here is that you're going to forget most of what you learn in college, right? But here's the optimistic way that I like to look at it, is think about the classes that you took last semester. So maybe you took sociology, maybe you took introduction to film, whatever. The class that you took, think about everything you remember about that class. Think about what your tests were like. Think about what the assignments were like. Think about what movies or texts you watched or read. Think about everything you can in this brief period of time as an example. That information that you remember is probably going to be what you remember a year from now, and 2 years from now, and even 3 years from now. All of that stuff has made it through this forgetting curve. We're now way, way, way out here, right? So what we remember is not a lot, but what we do remember is going to be pretty stable for the next several months. So that's the optimistic side of things, is that after the first few days, we forget a lot of what we learned. But after that, what we're left with is something that we will remember for quite some time. So essentially, I don't want to go into this too much because it just kind of reiterates what I mentioned earlier. But what this means about how we should study is essentially that you should prepare. You should prepare to forget a lot of what you've studied. Oftentimes we feel pretty good when we're studying, and then we feel like, oh, I forgot all this stuff. That's not fair. Maybe it was the exam that was hard. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I have a bad memory. No. You have a perfectly fine memory. It's just that our memories suck. Just like our memories are not very good. We forget a lot of what we learn the moment we go to sleep. And when we wake up, we've already forgotten a lot of that stuff that we studied. That's just human nature. That's just natural. So with that being said, you should study knowing that. You should go into it over preparing. You should not just feel comfortable with what you're studying, but you should feel like you've mastered it because you know that you're going to forget some of it later on. All right, so let's test our memory. So I'm going to give you some word stems. And these word stems are going to be the first few letters of a word, and I want you to think about what that word could possibly be. All right, so here they are. So these are all words that you heard in the first list. And so as you're looking at these, some of them may pop out at you. Some of them may not. All right, and so as you're looking over that, usually what I see in the classroom is people might get maybe 5 words whenever they're first doing this. But whenever they get these list stems, now that we've been 15 minutes away from learning all that stuff, people have a tendency to remember way more than just 5 words. They remember maybe half of these words now. And so that leads me to a very interesting, I think, question, which is, if you remember them now and you didn't earlier, what the hell happened? Why do you remember that stuff now? All right, so that's a good part to stop this video with that cliffhanger, which is something that we're going to be answering over the next couple of chapters, not just in the next video. But the way that we ask the question about how we remember things changes how much we remember and how we remember it. Okay, I'll catch you in the next video. See you soon. Bye.